And Heather is a medical radiation technologist, a lecturer, and an author from St. John. She has over 30 years experience in diagnostic imaging, specializing in the fields of urological imaging and mammography. She's been involved in international research projects with the American Cancer Society and Pacific Northwest Cancer Foundation, as well as ongoing local research into prostate cancer screening. This is Movember. And the use of Doppler ultrasound in extracorporeal shockwave I'll leave that to Heather. Lithotripsy. It's not a word correct. I'm familiar with. It is wonderful for someone to cross the divide from medical services into history. I congratulate Heather on that. She has delivered a series of educational seminars to the public, presented to the Urology Nurses of Canada, and co-authored a study for the Canadian Urological Association. A lifelong love of history and a chance find, I think I want to know more about that, turned her attention toward Canada's role in the 1914-18 war. Her first book, a nonfiction look at the First World War, titled Somewhere in Flanders, was published in November 2019. She's currently working on a novel of the Great War. We are very pleased to introduce her this evening. We're looking forward to a different presentation, very timely. Heather, welcome.
Thank you very much, Lois, and thank you to the Royal Nova Scotia Historical Society for having me here. I just want to say, first off, I'm not a historian. I'm not an academic. But I actually kind of went into the X-ray field thinking I might go into archaeology. So it's not such a strange difference to go from the medical field to kind of a historical field. Yeah, I'm just going to bring up my screen here. I hope everybody can see that. What is history? To me, history is not the dry recitation of facts and events and dates. History is the story of ordinary people, and more particularly ordinary people making extraordinary sacrifices. That's what touches us most deeply. It's what breathes life into the past. And one such story involves a young man from Dartmouth and the girl who waited in vain for him to come home to her. It's the story of friends, of sacrifices, and unimaginable personal losses. Uh-oh. Now I have a slight snag. There we go. All right. The summer of 1914 found the Dartmouth native, James Johnstone, out on the prairies enjoying life. Then, as now, young Maritimers flocked west. They went there to expand their horizons, see a wider part of the world, of the country, to find new opportunities and to find good paying jobs. And things really haven't much changed in the last 100 years or so. He'd graduated from the Halifax County Academy in 1912, and he was out there busy building a career with the railroads. He traveled to Edmonton in May of 1914 with his very good friend, Freeman Pierce, who was also from Dartmouth. It was a chance for him, perhaps, to escape from his family and to make a name for himself, quite literally. James William Johnstone was the third in his family with that name. His grandfather, James, had been a provincial court judge. His great-grandfather, James William Johnstone, the Honorable James William Johnstone, was a former Supreme Court judge. He was celebrated in Nova Scotia as one of the greatest statesmen in the province. He was a staunch supporter of Confederation. He was a long-term MLA. He was the leader of the Conservative Party in Nova Scotia, and he was the third premier of the province. James Sr. mentored his successor as leader and premier, a man named Sir Charles Tupper, who was the father of Confederation and was the 6th Prime Minister of Canada. James Sr.'s picture hung in Province House, the provincial legislature building in Halifax. It may still hang there, I don't know. His mansion, Mount Emilia, still stands on a hillside in Dartmouth, and it's right below the street that is named for him. The name was no doubt kind of a heavy legacy for a 20-something-year-old, but Jim, as he preferred to be called, would actually let you call him Jimmy if you were a friend. When he went out west, he left behind the girl he'd fallen in love with, a shy, studious 17-year-old, still in her last year at the academy, and her name was Isabelle McCurdy. Isabelle is my grandmother. The McCurdy clan in Nova Scotia seemed to be quite a proud bunch. I really didn't know much about this side of my family, but there's actually a book about the McCurdys in Nova Scotia that was published in the 1930s, and they claim descent from the chief of the clan McCurdy in 14th century Scotland. It details their long history in Nova Scotia. Isabelle's cousin Doug, as she called him, who was actually her father's third cousin, had in 1909 been the first British subject to fly an airplane, the Silver Dart, for his boss, Alexander Graham Bell. And Doug was later appointed Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. Isabelle's father was William McCurdy. He had worked his way up from errand boy to journalist to editor of the Halifax Herald. And he actually spent a brief time in jail in 1914 for refusing to name the source of a letter in his newspaper that alleged political corruption. It became a catalyst for discussions over having Canadian laws to support a newspaper's right to keep their sources private. And unfortunately, that law wasn't actually on the books until nearly 100 years later. William had high standards, but he found Jim a rather suitable young man for his daughter. When Jim left for Edmonton, he and Isabelle, who he most commonly addressed as Chiquita, and I have no idea why, I don't think we'll ever find out why, they continued a correspondence that had begun after he graduated from school, and only the last 69 letters survive. They're dated September 4th, 1914 to February 22nd, 1916. They tell the story of the first men to enlist in Canada's brand new Expeditionary Force, for their evolution from a rather disrespectful, irreverent rabble to a fighting force deserving of the hard-earned respect of the, at first, very skeptical British military. Did Jim have an inkling there was a war brewing that summer? It's questionable whether anyone really believed that what was going on in Europe would boil over, and indeed many of the countries did all they could to kind of ease the hostilities. Nobody, except possibly the German Kaiser, really wanted a fight. But Jim was very well read. He read a lot of newspapers, and he would have been well aware of the news coming out of Europe, and he was probably completely unsurprised that there was a declaration of war. Shortly after the August 4th, 1914 declaration, Jim and his friend Freeman presented themselves to a recruiting office of the 101st Edmonton Fusiliers, which later became the 9th Battalion. They were prepared to do their duty. And one might write off their enlistment as just part of that eager and kind of naive movement that flooded recruiting officers around the country. Young and old men were excited by an adventure. They looked forward to a free trip to Europe, a good bit of fighting, great story to tell their family when they got back at Christmas. When Jim was far more clear-headed and perceptive. In a letter that he wrote from Valcartier camp in Quebec, where all the volunteers were assembled for training, Jim wrote, "We are all glad to hear of the British and Allies' victories, but I, for one, do not put much credence in what one hears, for we are up against one of the greatest nations of the age, a nation who has vast resources of money to draw upon, and one who has been preparing for just this event for a long time. And although maybe some of their plans have miscarried yet, they of course have made allowance for some such things, and this is not the end by any means." Jim wasn't worried that it was going to be over before he got there. His only concern was getting there at all, actually. He wrote, "I do hope I'll be able to go on the first contingent, as they will be the pick of the camp. Goodness knows I am trying hard enough to go." The government of Canada had pledged a 25,000-man division to the British, and at the time, their professional army numbered less than 3,200. But by September of 1914, somewhere between 33 and 36,000 Canadians, depending on what source you look at, had arrived at Valcartier. And of course, not all of these guys would be suitable to send overseas as part of a military force. However, Jim was a healthy young man, and he was a former member of the 66th Princess Louise Fusiliers militia in Halifax. And right there, he should not have been concerned. In fact, he was offered a promotion. "Today I was promoted to corporal in F Company, but refused to leave the decent bunch we have in D, and was put back in the ranks again to private." Jim shared the news of camp, which he called a buzzing beehive of activity. Further in this letter, he wrote, "We have several little excitements to keep things lively. For instance, a suicide in the Calgary Regiment. Here you will exclaim, how perfectly dreadful. A woman found dressed in soldier's clothes, tents on fire, a night alarm to see how quickly the men gather together from out of bed. This morning, a report came in that the guards shot 2 men trying to poison the water supply." Now, we don't often think of the war actually touching Canadian shores, but obviously there were German spies and German sympathizers in Canada at the time. In any event, Jim was chosen to go, as were almost 30,000 others. The Canadian government decided to keep their reserve forces in England rather than Canada, where they'd be readily available to replace the inevitable casualties. They would form a base for a future 2nd Division if it was needed, and ultimately Canada fielded 4 divisions by 1917, an entire Army Corps of her own. Jim boarded the SS Zealand in Quebec City, and October 3rd, 1914, a 30-ship convoy left for Europe with all these men. The Canadian Navy had 2 ships. So the government, to get all those men over, contracted from the shipping lines like the Red Star Line. I think Cunard was involved. White Star Line ships were also leased, rented, contracted to take them. At the time, this was the largest troop movement across the Atlantic in history. They had a mostly uneventful trip across the pond. There was only one poor fellow who was thrown overboard by some of his mates and fortunately was picked up by one of the ships following in the convoy. And they successfully avoided the German submarines that had been sent out looking for them. The German government did get wind of this convoy. Unfortunately, they didn't know where they were going, so they never found them. The ships landed in Plymouth late in October. And this photograph is actually Jim's actual battalion. One of the interesting ways, if you look at these guys' tunics, that you can tell a Canadian from British soldiers, the Canadians had 7 buttons on their uniforms and the British had 5 buttons on their uniforms. So at a quick glance, you can tell who were the Canadians and who were British, and these guys are definitely Canadians. The Canadians were welcomed by an enthusiastic and very grateful British public. Jim wrote, "I will never forget as long as I live that march to the train through Plymouth. Everyone was out and lined the streets and gave us such a hearty welcome. I know my arm was tired out shaking hands with the old men and maidens, etc., to say nothing of the kids. All my Canadian coins were given away long before the station was reached, and most of the fellows had given nearly all their buttons away, to say nothing of their maple leaf badges and their Canada shoulder badges." The regimental quartermaster sergeants must have been furious when these guys landed at camp and needed to be resupplied. The Canadian troops spent the winter of 1914-15 in camps at Salisbury Plain, and they were the absolute despair of the British officers due to poor behavior. Now, it wasn't maliciously bad behavior. They were just excited and having a great time and visiting the local pubs, and saw absolutely no reason why you should salute an officer and call him sir. Who knew? Jim was a little more straight-laced, and he took quite seriously to heart the reputation of one Nova Scotia battalion, and I think it's possibly the 17th Nova Scotia Highlanders. He wrote, "The Nova Scotia Battalion is in our brigade. They have not much of a reputation, I'm sorry to say, for out of 400 or 500, there were 102 in the guard room 2 days ago. So if anything happens and you ask someone who did it, they'll say, 'Oh, the Blue Noses.' It makes one sore to hear them say so." Jim endured his winter in Salisbury quite cheerfully. It was incredibly wet and miserable and cold and windy. It was the worst winter in living memory. He did get to spend time in London on 2 occasions. The Canadian military were actually quite generous with leaves for the men, and they handed out train tickets for anywhere they wanted to go. Jim trained hard, as they all did, and he chafed at getting over to France and Belgium. He wanted to go do his bit. He was able to get a photograph while he was in Salisbury to send back to Isabelle of himself on the right and his friend Freeman Pierce on the left, and a new friend he had made at Valcartier, Murray Southgate, and that's Murray in the middle. Murray was an Englishman who had been living and working in Halifax when the war broke out. He's a private with the 13th Battalion, Royal Highlanders of Canada, and he was a good friend of and wrote to Isabelle's sister, Daisy. Isabelle's father was quite happy to publish this photograph in the Halifax Herald early in the winter of 1915. The sad part about it is only one of these young men ever made it home. Jim also made some new friends from New Zealand while he was in Salisbury, but the winter was so incredibly brutal, the New Zealand government withdrew their troops from England and sent them to the much milder climate of Egypt for training. And Jim saw them off. He wrote about it. He said, yesterday, the New Zealanders entrained at Bulford, and we had to form a guard of honor to escort them to the station. They are fine fellows, and I formed any number of friends among them. When they got to the station, they formed a large ring, and a fellow in the center did the Maori war dance, which principally consists of tying oneself into knots and waving your arms about as if you were crazy, and all the time emitting the most ungodly yells, while the rest of the fellows forming the ring joined in the chorus. Anyone hearing them from a distance would have thought that all the cats and dogs in creation were having a free-for-all fight and giving vent to their outraged feelings at the same time. That's quite a description of a haka. In February of 1915, when the first 3 Canadian brigades were finally sent to France, Jim and Freeman were left behind. The 9th Battalion was part of the reserve force left in Salisbury. However, Jim was soon transferred into the 2nd Battalion, Eastern Ontario Regiment, just a few weeks later, and Freeman actually joined him in that exact same battalion later in May of 1915. Jim arrived in France in March 22nd and expressed how he liked very much being at the front. Exactly 1 month later, he was engulfed in the ferocious fighting that was the Second Battle of Ypres. He wrote to Isabelle the day before the battle, April 21st, 1915, which was her 18th birthday. He said, a certain town within a mile or so of here has just been under a very severe bombardment by the Germans. It would make anyone heartsick to see the women and children and old men hurrying away from their homes with only what they can carry with them. The road is practically blocked with motor lorries, transports, ambulances, etc., carrying the refugees away. And those who are not fortunate to get a ride are pulling little carts with their personal necessities in them. The people of Ypres were still living in the town. They were farming in the fields, even though there was this battle raging around them. That all came to an end on that 21st of April, 1915. The next day, on the 22nd, Jim experienced firsthand the first chlorine gas attacks of the war. And the Germans, with their gas, blew open a 5-mile hole in the front line. This was the kind of opening that both sides have been looking for a long time. Jim wrote about the gas. He said, the gas affects the eyes and throat, and one has not even a fighting chance against them. It killed a lot of the French territorial soldiers who were in that part of the line. The rest of them fled, and the Germans came pouring in here. Against the Germans were thrown 18,000 basically untested Canadian soldiers, tasked to stop what Jim heard were 100,000 Germans. Now, what the actual number is, it doesn't matter. They were vastly outnumbered. Through some luck, some hard fighting, and a kind of fortuitous ignorance of proper military tactics, being they didn't realize enough that they should strategically retreat when they're nearly overwhelmed, and instead the Canadians stayed where they were because they were told to go there, and so they went there and stayed. They confused the Germans. The Germans figured there must be more reinforcements coming. Whoops. And so they stopped. And the Canadians dug in along this line. The line was actually pushed back eventually here. Jim spent 2.5 days right here at Oblong Farm below Kitchener's Wood, dug into the very shallow and inadequate French trenches. When the British saw that the line had broken here, they made a plan, and now the Yser Canal runs across the opening of the salient, and they had planned to blow the bridges to stop the Germans from getting any further. and they were prepared to sacrifice 50,000 men who were in the salient at the time. But when they realized that the Canadians had halted the Germans in their tracks, they thankfully discarded that plan. Jim was able to write to Isabelle days later after the battle, and his words are an understatement. This was a little tiny card that came, and you can see it still kind of has some mud of Ypres on it right there. He said, "Got through the Battle of Ypres all right. Sorry to say we have all had many casualties, but at present don't know just who is missing or wounded, etc. Very terrible battle while it lasted. Everyone behaved splendidly." And that is absolutely true. The Canadian division did behave splendidly. He wrote to her a few days after this, and he said, "How I got through, I don't know. 2 bullets went through the pack I was carrying, and later on was struck in the side. The iron entrenching tool, which I was carrying, saved me. The bullet glanced off, denting the tool and stunning me for a bit." Of the 1,027 men of the 2nd Battalion who marched into the salient on the night of April 22nd, only 376 answered the roll call a few days later. The 18,000 man Canadian division sustained 6,000 casualties in total. 1 out of every 3 men were wounded, missing, or killed. And unfortunately, Murray Southgate was one of the missing. Now, Jim went on to fight at Festubert and Givenchy. They were 2 major engagements that Canadians were involved in May and June of 1915. Jim was wounded at Givenchy, and he wrote from Boulogne, where the hospitals were, to Isabelle. He said, "I happened to get wounded slightly in the left hand on June 15th by a shrapnel. You see, our trench and the Germans were about 40 yards apart, and being a scout, 4 of us were in the front line with 2 officers, marking the effects and telephoning them back of our shells. The bombardment had been kept up for 3 days before the attack, when a German whiz-bang comes over and knocks us all in a heap. Alas, it knocked down the 2 officers and 1 of the scouts. While I got off with only a slight wound in the hand and just a touch over the eye, I consider myself very fortunate indeed." In fact, the scout who was knocked out was killed outright. The 2 officers were so badly wounded, they were invalided back to Canada, and they served out the rest of the war as trainers in Canada. I found reference to this particular incident in the personal diary of the 2nd Battalion commander, Colonel David Watson, and he actually named the officers involved and verified Jim's account. One of the officers was Lieutenant Ackerman, who signed, he actually censored Jim's letters and signed that censor stamp on the envelope that I showed in a previous slide. Colonel Watson himself actually went on to a fantastic career with the Canadian military. He was promoted to Major General, and he commanded the 4th Canadian Division on the attack on Vimy Ridge in 1917. So Jim recuperated at Boulogne, and then he headed back to the front. Givenchy was the Canadian Division's last big offensive for the year of 1915, and they were posted to the Plugstreet area of the line, and this was considered a very quiet part of the line. Still, Jim had a few adventures while he was there. He sent this little note: "I don't think you could guess where I'm writing this from. Well, just at present, I am under the German front line trench in a mine head. My particular duty being to listen here if the Germans are countermining. I can hear Fritz talking in muffled tones and can also hear the click of his rifle bolt and the report of his rifle just above my head." During this time, Jim wrote numerous letters trying to find Murray, who was rumored to be in either a hospital or possibly a German prisoner of war camp. He received a telegram from Murray's sister via a French operator whose English was just a little bit sketchy. Murray in Cologne Hospital, Southgate. Now, Cologne, Germany was where a lot of the prisoner of war camps were, so I'm sure that's misspelled, but that's where they mean. Jim was able to enjoy visits with friends. There was actually a lot of socializing and social visits between the battalions if people were in their billets during their rest part of their rotation. He got parcels from Isabelle. She filled them with fruit cake and candies and knitted objects. And there was always talk about what the future might hold. He wrote here, a rumor is going around both in the trenches and back at the base that all the 1st Canadian contingent who were still in the firing line by Christmas would be taken out and probably sent back to Canada, and the Home Guard there sent out to the front. But I expect, like most rumors, it has no foundation. And unfortunately for Jim, that was true. It was also here in Plug Street that Jim took great advantage of training courses in bombing, what we call grenades, they called bombs, and machine gunning, scouting. He had a plan, and he hoped to get leave to London to move his plan along. And he wrote, you've been wondering why I've been taking so many different courses and things. Well, you see, I have had a definite object in view ever since I came out to this country, and I'm trying to put it through. That is one very great reason why I wished for my pass some months ago. I wanted to see Sir Charles Tupper, who was a very great friend of my aunt's in London, and through her I could have secured an introduction. But now, of course, on account of Sir Charles Tupper's death, that channel is closed. I'll have to try some other tack. It's so very hard out here to do anything, as the colonel seems to have the divine right of kings, and his word is law, and if he puts his foot down on anything, it is finny. Well, unfortunately, Jim was unwilling to tell Isabelle exactly what his plan was until he carried it out, and it seems that Colonel Watson was unrelenting. It's just my theory, but given Jim's fascination with airplanes, he mentioned them all the time. I kind of think he may have been hoping for a transfer into the Royal Flying Corps. One thing Jim didn't talk much about were the mental and physical strains of the war. He did express concern about his own mental health, although he never actually said it quite that way. He merely wondered if Isabelle would find him changed, and he thought he might be becoming quieter. His few comments are more powerful for their brevity. Shellfire has a bad effect on the nerves, even if you escape being hit, so a rest is always eagerly looked forward to by everybody. You feel the strain after you get away from the firing line much more than when you're right there. Later he wrote, it's when an advance or charge comes off, then you realize how terrible it is, and not being able to help the poor chaps out there. Oh, hang it, I did not mean to get into that strain. Fatalism played on Jim's mind, and actually it did on most of the men out there. There was a common theme in the trenches amongst the British and Canadian, all the Commonwealth soldiers, and it was waiting for the bullet or the shell with your name on it. Referencing Omar Kyam, he wrote, I've seen some chaps take all kinds of chances, a very great many more than they should have, and get through all right. And then again, other chaps take all the possible care they can and perhaps show themselves for an instant, and in that instant, they get it. I think if a person is destined to get it, he will, whatever happens, and no matter how much precaution he may take. But of course, I don't believe in a man taking needless risks. And I think he added that last bit just to reassure her that he was taking care of himself. I find his terms kind of interesting. His friends are knocked down or they get it. They're not killed. Jim seemed to have an almost chivalric need to never distress Isabelle too much with the grim reality of his situation. However, he was very well aware of where he was, and in every letter, or nearly every letter, he expressed his hope to see her if he should have the good fortune to be spared. He usually did find something upbeat to tell her, and he never could resist teasing her, once accusing her of getting into her father's wine cellar, as her previous letter had been a little more bubbly than usual, I think. And he liked to tell her amusing stories. As the trenches were only about 150 yards apart, it was very easy to shout over to the Germans. At dusk, both sides seemed to quit shooting as if by mutual consent, and our chaps would shout over, "Hello, Fritz, how are the sausages today?" And then they would answer, and remarks not very complimentary to the Kaiser would be shouted over to them, and then they would open up with their machine guns, but as long as you kept your head below the parapet, you were all right. There were satisfying moments sending rapid fire over at the German lines with their newly issued Lee Enfield rifles. They were considered far superior to the Canadian issued Ross rifle, and Jim enjoyed it quite a bit. Well, we had the pleasure of giving Fritz a mad minute one night, and I don't think he enjoyed it very much. My own rifle got so hot that the oil in the wood sputtered and sizzled. It worked like a charm, and I will always swear by the Lee Enfield rifle for trench work. The British introduced the Canadians to the concept of the mad minute, a platoon of soldiers, which was somewhere between 10 or 15 soldiers, each firing 12 or more shots per minute, had actually quite often tricked the Germans into thinking they were facing a machine gun. The Lee Enfield rifle with the smooth bolt action was actually perfect for this kind of stunt, as Jim would call it. Through the fall months, Jim remained committed to the cause. He never wavered in his support of the war effort, and he strongly believed that if Canadian and British men didn't step up, that conscription was warranted. Everyone needed to remain focused and positive, he believed. Jim read newspapers and he watched quite anxiously the situation in the Balkans, acknowledging the danger presented when Bulgaria joined the German side. But he opined it will not affect the ultimate outcome of the war, but will only prolong it and cause more useless loss of life. We are bound to win in the end if everyone does his or her part, as the strain upon Germany must be ever so much greater than upon us. And it's kind of nice that he acknowledged women's role in the war as well. In December of 1915, Nova Scotia's reputation was very much on his mind again. This time it was the 25th Battalion who had joined them in the trenches in September. And he wrote, "You mentioned in your letter about the 25th Battalion, so then you must know something about the poor showing they made some time ago when the Germans blew up the mine. And they were for a time in disgrace, but no doubt they've got their name back again. As I understand, there's been a considerable change in the officers. And when given a chance again, they will make good and be amongst the best battalions out here. I sincerely hope so, because they are Nova Scotians like myself, and one always wants to see his native province to the front." In a side note, Jim explained the torn corner of this letter as the work of a wee, poor, timorous, cowering mousie that he'd heard nibbling in his pack as he was using it as a pillow. I have my suspicions it was more likely one of the ubiquitous rats that plagued the trench, but I don't think he wanted to tell her that. Jim enjoyed a march into Bayeux, France with his battalion for a full Christmas dinner. He finally got his leave pass in January of 1916 and spent a lovely 7 days sleeping in a real bed. He unfortunately just missed his sister Alice. She had arrived with a medical corps. She was a nursing sister, and she just arrived a couple days too late to see him. There was a special passenger on his boat over to England. The Prince of Wales deigned to patronize the boat we came over on. He seems to be quite a sport and had a pipe stuck out from his mouth at a rakish angle. The Prince of Wales was actually quite a favorite amongst the men at the front. In January, he got some new equipment. We had steel helmets served out to us in the trenches. They look like inverted soup plates. However, they are very good things. I know of 2 chaps whose lives were probably saved by these. The fighting continued into the winter. It was more of a defensive effort, although trench raiding, which the Canadians made into an art form, continued through that winter. And Jim volunteered for one such raid that failed right at the outset. The advance party were cut up badly, and Jim lost one of his favorite officers. Captain George Richardson was quite a noted hockey player when he was at university at Queen's University. They actually challenged Ottawa for the Stanley Cup in 1906. And he was later inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. So this man is kind of Canadian royalty. Jim called him one of the very best officers that ever put on khaki. Jim was quite proud that he was able to go to George Richardson's funeral. Not long after the funeral, it was a calm, clear, quiet day in February 1916. Jim finished one last letter to Isabelle and he tucked it in his pack. He always made note that he liked to pass his letters in right away to make the mail, but this time it didn't happen. Before he had a chance to do that, Jim was killed. Perhaps a sniper got him, or a fragment from a high explosive shell. There were a few dropped. The battalion war diary said enemy threw a few small high explosive shells around Cooker's Farm. That probably is what happened to Jim. Neither the battalion war diary nor Colonel Watson's personal diary made any comment about casualties. They sometimes did, and I assume it was over quite quickly because there's no mention of medical care or died of wounds in Jim's own records. And it's my hope he never really saw it coming. But for Jim, the war was over. The last letter arrived in Canada sometime later with his other possessions, presumably, as there's no stamps and there's no postmark on it. And this letter is quite heartbreaking. It's kind of unlike his normally cheerful previous letters. He said, sometimes one gets a little bit lonely, you know, thinking about things and the war and about one's friends, some of whom one will never see again. You know, it's apt to make a person just a wee bit downhearted, a wee bit. And he mused about his own state of mind. He said, I think a person out here gets very selfish in a way, and one seems to live his own little life with his few particular friends and just does not care or take any interest in others. Isabelle, do you think from my letters that I am changing? Please tell me, won't you? But he thought of Isabelle at the end, as he always did. He said, you know, girl of mine, you ought to enjoy yourself a little anyway. You owe it to yourself. You will forgive me, dear, for having spoken, but you know I love you, so that I can't bear the thought of you giving up every enjoyment. So au revoir, sweetheart, Jim. Jim was buried at RE Farms Cemetery near Wolvergem in Flanders, not far from where he fell. Wolvergem is here, RE Farm is up here, Cooker's Farm is right here. The news arrived in Halifax 2 weeks later, and William McCurdy took a kind of an unprecedented step of writing and publishing a front page article in Jim's memory. And it's clear that he had a great deal of respect for this young man. He said, a brave young soldier fell when Private James W. Johnstone of the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Canadian Division was killed in action at the front on February 23rd last. He was a Dartmouth boy, son of Prescott Johnstone, and a great-grandson of Honorable J.W. Johnstone, one of the fathers of Nova Scotia and most distinguished statesmen of the country. The word that Private Johnstone had fallen came in a telegram yesterday to his father. The young man was only 21 years of age, and like many another, he willingly gave his life for his country and for the defense of truth, justice, right, liberty, and the flag. And I just can't imagine that kind of flowery language in a newspaper article these days. It went on to say the telegram bringing the news that he had joined the Empire's and Nova Scotia's shining roll of honor simply stated that he was killed in action. A touching fact in connection with the news in the telegram was that by the mail yesterday morning, there came a letter from him written in that firing line from whence he was destined never to return. On the second page of the newspaper, there were 2 further columns detailing the eulogies given for Jim in the legislature by Premier Murray, by the leader of the opposition, and by the MLA for Dartmouth, all because of his great-grandfather. There's a plaque on the wall of Christ Church in Dartmouth, and Christ Church is where Jim was baptized and where the family worshipped, and it stated quite a dubious honor. Jim was the first Dartmouth man to die in the war. Isabelle quite obviously treasured Jim's memory all her life. She saved his letters. She didn't save letters from other people she corresponded with in the trenches. And I'm quite grateful she did save these letters. She did marry, and she had a house full of children, my father being one. And she lived a very full life, but I don't think she was ever again that Chiquita who Jim knew. She outlived him by 51 years. Freeman Pierce was buried when a trench collapsed during shelling in June of 1916, and he was hospitalized off and on for the rest of the war with shell shock. He was later discharged home to Halifax. Murray's Southgate status went from missing in action to presumed dead in April of 1916, a year after he was last seen. His name is inscribed on Menin Gate, on the memorial in Ypres, along with 54,000 others who disappeared in the Ypres salient. Some were buried as known unto God. They have no name, and most of them were never found at all. With the amount of shelling that took place over that much disputed piece of ground, it's unlikely Murray was ever found. The Dartmouth MLA was named Mr. Finn. I don't know his first name. He grew up with Jim in Dartmouth, actually. He felt Jim had all the best qualities of heart and mind that were attributed to his great-grandfather, and believed he would have made a distinguished career had he survived the war. He felt Jim's death had brought home a lesson in Dartmouth of the sacrifices that were being made all across the country. He believed that his memory would live in the hearts of the people of Nova Scotia and the town of Dartmouth. And this was certainly my objective in publishing these letters. It's my hope that Jim's story and his picture may be a part of the Hometown Heroes display in the Halifax Citadel. And I've contacted the site historian regarding that. This story of one short life is only one of many thousands of this war, and it was mostly unknown until the fall of 2018 when Jim's letter surfaced in a box of my grandmother's correspondence. One of my uncles told me he'd known of his mother's first fiancé, as he called him. Jim's immediate family petered out with one nephew who died in 1999, and I can't find out that he had any children, so there's really no one to remember Great Uncle Jim who served in the war. But Jim's own words have touched people all around the world now, actually, quite literally. And in Belgium, he has a friend and a guardian who's named Johan Moors. And Johan drops by to visit Jim at RE Farm. He dropped by on Remembrance Day for me and sent me a few pictures. Johan is passionate about this war and about the boys, as he calls the fallen. For Belgians like Johan, the Great War is not old history, but it's a living part of everyday life, and every day is a day to remember the sacrifice made by Canadians like Jim. And Johan sent me this. He said to Jim, "This morning I came to visit you. This was not just a visit like the many others before, but with a special message from home, Canada, and from me. There's a very special place within my heart reserved for you and all the fallen. The letters you have written to your dearest endeared you to me. A small quote I said at your grave today, a passage from one of your preferred poet-philosophers, Omar Kyam. Don't cry upon your losses. Don't measure today with tomorrow's. Don't trust to past and coming day. Believe in now and be happy today. Till next time, lest we forget. And I really think Jim would appreciate that, because I think Jim did try his best to be happy today. Now, in just a little epilogue, Jim's letters are actually now in the safekeeping of the New Brunswick archives. We actually offered them to the Nova Scotia archives, and they weren't horribly enthusiastic or interested. To be fair, at the time, we really didn't know Jim's family history, and they may have been more interested if they realized who he was. Kind of ironically, the Nova Scotia Archives website has a special page with letters, all three of them from Jim's second cousin, Captain L. Howard Johnstone, who also fell at the front in 1916. I would have liked, in some ways, for these letters to return to Halifax, very close to where they were addressed, actually, but I can't help being a little bit selfish and happy that I get to pop up to Fredericton anytime I want to read the letters. And it's almost a little bit like visiting Jim, which unfortunately, because of COVID, I was not able to do in April. And that's it for me. So I think we are going to open the floor if there are any questions, and maybe somebody who is...
Yes. Hi.
Take over.
Hi. People may be able to hear